Hello everybody, Dr. Alex Vasquez here on September 1st of 2019. Today I'm going to discuss antiviral strategies, which is a topic that I first started to talk about in 2014 when I published kind of the updated version of the antiviral strategy, which had been previously published in 2009 and was then formally published as a separate book in 2014. So we'll take a look at some of that past information, and then of course as quickly as possible, I will try to dive into today's information, which is basically going to kind of set the stage, so to speak, for some future presentations where I'll get into more detail. But what I think is necessary today, since I haven't really discussed this topic in detail for about the past 5 years, at least not in a video presentation format such as this, what I'd like to do is kind of revisit the structure, and then in future videos, that will enable me to dive right into therapeutics, but I, of course, think that context is very important, so I am going to kind of refresh the context for this antiviral strategy here in today's presentation. So as I just stated, I published this antiviral strategy in 2009 for the first time, and then formalized it and gave it some structure in 2014. So this was initially published in 2009, in a book called Chiropractic and Naturopathic Mastery of Common Clinical Disorders. Then it was updated in 2014 for Naturopathic Rheumatology version 3.5, which is now published as Inflammation Mastery 4th edition in 2016. So after updating that information and providing some structure to that new protocol, I called it Antiviral Strategies and Immune Nutrition, also published as an ebook simply titled Antiviral Nutrition. I also published this in an article that's available online. You can see the hyperlink provided here. This was also published in a blog, which I'm actually quite proud of. The title of this blog is "The Proof is in the Panic. We Need a New Strategy Against Viral Infections." You can find that online. Also a conference presentation at the International Congress on Naturopathic Medicine in 2016. You can find that video online as well. Also various videos and internet articles at ichnfm.org, antiviral, and that series progresses from antiviral 1 to antiviral 2, antiviral 3, antiviral 4, etc. Also on inflammationmastery.com, antiviral, I have kind of a summary there with several videos previously made. The major thesis presented in this work is that only by understanding viral infections can we prevent and treat them rationally and effectively. And what I really mean there is having a conceptual model that helps us manage these viral infections from a clinical standpoint, not from a pathology standpoint or microbiologic standpoint, but what can we actually understand and then leverage that understanding into something that actually works in the real world, and that will be the emphasis here. I reasonably propose that most physicians do not have an articulated or clear understanding of viral infections. That's just my opinion, and you can agree or disagree. But that opinion comes from a lot of experience in education and administration, and also from having attended a leading U.S. medical school where I also scored in the top 1% and top 5% on 4 different U.S. medical licensing exams. Also, while I was in medical school, I was an honor student. I also did a predoctoral research fellowship through the National Institutes of Health, etc. And I've also studied various educational structures, and I've surveyed and followed the literature now for decades. So again, you can take or leave certain things that I say as my opinion, but that is my opinion, that most doctors don't understand viral infections from a clinical standpoint, and you can agree or disagree, but I think that my opinion is reasonable. So again, if we treat a condition, and in this case I'm talking about viral infections, if we try to treat these viral infections without a really good structured understanding, then in my opinion we're just fooling ourselves and we're just throwing drugs at what is really just a mystery to us. So what I'm going to try to develop in these videos is what I've already developed in the books, and that is to provide a structure and a structured understanding of viral infections that can be used clinically as well as in research and public health, etc. So let's start with some questions here. So everyone has an opinion, and many people think they're knowledgeable. That is, until someone asks a question. So I am going to start by proposing or challenging some questions here. So let's start here with an assessment of some basic knowledge. Again, I think that most physicians cannot answer these questions. So let's start with an open-ended question. Discuss the process of viral infection from start to finish. And then later we might advance that to provide an overview and then list specific nuances for common illnesses. So I'm sure that if you think about this question, you'll agree that it's a very reasonable question. Discuss the process of viral infection from start to finish. So we all talk about viral infections on the internet, in journal articles, in research conferences, in clinical conferences, etc. But let's give structure to that conversation. Instead of just throwing out this concept of viral infection, discuss what it is from start to finish. So we should all be able to agree on some basic components of what is a viral infection. And I could easily propose, and I am proposing here, that unless we have an agreed upon structure and agreed upon understanding, then we're all using this phrase viral infection and measles epidemic and all this conversation, but unless we know and have some agreement on what that term actually means, then we're using words, but we're really not communicating very effectively. So here's a different version of the same question. This is a guiding question, and this question I've kind of structured at a basic science level. List the 4 main components of a viral infection. So what are the 4 main components of a viral infection? Some people might say, well, maybe we can come up with 3, or maybe we can come up with 5 or 6, but I think that we should keep this list as short as possible while still being complete. And in my review of the research and having studied this for 20-something years, I've come up with 4 main components, and I think that those components are the most important. Again, somebody else might say 3 components or 6 components or whatever. I've chosen 4, and I would invite anyone to argue with me on this or debate in any manner whatsoever. But in my opinion, we can't say less than 4, and we could say more than 4, but I think that would be unnecessary. So if we were to advance this question to a clinical level, the question would be phrased, or could be phrased in this way: list the 4 main components of a viral infection and provide conceptual interventions for each. And then provide actual clinical, real-world interventions, dose, risks, mechanisms, benefits, and any collateral benefits. So again, if we're going to discuss viral infections, we need to understand what we're talking about. We need to have a defined and structured understanding of what that concept means. And that's important for research perspectives, for public health perspectives, and also, of course, clinical perspectives, whether we're treating patients or whether we are parents treating our children, or, of course, treating ourselves when we do get sick. So 4 main components. If you really understand that, then you would be able to understand 4 interventions, or 4 levels of interventions, we might say. And then based on that, you would or should be able to discuss what are some of the treatments that you would actually implement. So again, we go from understanding to a conceptualization of how we might approach each aspect of that understanding, and then how do we actually intervene. So components of the infection, ways to address each aspect of the infection, and then what do you actually do? Doses, risks, mechanisms, benefits, collateral benefits, cost effectiveness, etc. So here's question number 2, and again, we're just getting started here. So we're going to look at an image that comes from a really good journal, a good series of journals called the Trends journals. This one happens to be Trends in Pharmacological Sciences, published in 2014. The title of this article is Current Progress in Antiviral Strategies. And the image that I'm going to present to you is titled A Schematic Representation of the Viral Life Cycle. So I'm not criticizing this journal, I'm not criticizing the author, and I'm not even really criticizing the image. I'm just using this image as a representative example of what a typical medical student or medical doctor or medical resident would study in any given pathology or microbiology textbook. This is a very typical example. Now, of course, this is specific to this particular article, but in any pathology or microbiology book, you would find a diagram that looks more or less like this. So again, I'm simply using this diagram as a representative example of how medical students are taught and how doctors are taught. when they are being taught about how viral infections propagate and progress, and therefore how antiviral strategies such as antiviral drugs can be employed. So let's take a look at this diagram and identify any errors, either molecular errors or conceptual errors. So I would say, for example, when looking at this diagram, that it's not quite a cartoon, but it's also certainly not very detailed. For some people, they might look at this and say, wow, that's a lot of information, but it's actually not. A lot more is happening in the entry of viruses and the production of viral particles on the other side. So when we look at a diagram like this, we're kind of getting a cartoon-like image. And I think that what I just said there is actually important, because if doctors are taught in a cartoon-like way, then the interventions that they employ conceivably might also be somewhat comedic. So anyway, let's take a look at this. Identify any errors. Let's assume that the diagram is factually correct, but what else is missing? If this is how we're going to see viral infections, what is missing from this story, if anything? Maybe you think it's perfect the way that it is. So what are the implications of relying on such a model? So I will answer those questions at the end of this presentation. While I was preparing this exact presentation that we're looking at right now, I did look at the medical literature to see what's kind of developed over the last couple of years. I found this book, Antiviral Strategies, from 2009. Very interestingly, this book does not contain a single chapter on nutrition or improvement of host defense. So I think some of you are probably picking up now on what I'm trying to convey here, and that is, if our model for viral infection is inadequate, then our treatments for viral infections will likewise be inadequate. So this is an entire textbook written for medical professionals, and again published in 2009, 13 chapters, not a single chapter on host defense or nutrition. And in my opinion, any reasonable conversation on antiviral strategies would have to mention host defense and nutrition to support a proper and effective and robust immune response. So how can that be excluded from this conversation on such a consistent basis? Ultimately, my goal here is to decipher and deconstruct the phenomena of viral infections so that we can have insights that lead to better treatments. I've studied viral infections in several different capacities, mostly independently after my graduate education, which for me started in chiropractic college. I graduated from chiropractic college in 1996. I actually attended 2 different chiropractic colleges, and in the course of that education, we had courses in public health, microbiology, like basic microbiology, followed by clinical microbiology, and also courses in pathology. Because the treatment of infectious diseases was largely considered outside the scope of practice for chiropractic, these classes were treated in a very peripheral manner, and we had no conversation on therapeutics whatsoever, except we did have some conversation on maybe like how to treat a common cold, for example, in our clinical nutrition course, which was taught by a naturopathic physician. So again, that was my experience from having attended 2 different chiropractic colleges and graduating in 1996. After chiropractic college, I immediately went to naturopathic medical school. I graduated from that school in 1999, about 3.5 years later. I was given some credit for previous education in anatomy, physiology, pathology. That's why I was able to do a 4-year program in 3.5 years. So in naturopathic medical school, we had excellent instruction in basic microbiology, which I actually had to repeat. So I took basic and clinical microbiology in chiropractic college, then I had to repeat those courses in naturopathic school. Again, basic microbiology, clinical microbiology, and I would say that our class was actually quite excellent. Then, throughout the duration of our education in naturopathic medical school, we also had antiviral strategies and antiviral therapeutics integrated into our other courses, such as gynecology, EENT or eye, ear, nose, throat, also pediatrics and dermatology. So of my 3 graduate doctorate level degrees, naturopathic medicine certainly provided the best education in the treatment of infectious diseases. Then after I graduated in 1999, I practiced in Seattle, Washington. Then I practiced in Houston, Texas for a while. And then later I went to osteopathic medical school and I graduated from that school in 2010. Our training in infectious diseases in osteopathic medical school was that we were presented with a 400-page textbook and told to go home and read it by yourself. Your exam is in 10 days, or it might have been 14 days, but about 2 weeks. So, of course, panic and protest ensued to no avail other than reading as fast as possible and mostly memorizing minutiae, which is how medical school education and testing seem to function. These days, medical school really isn't set up to produce clinicians. Medical school is set up to prepare people for two things primarily. One is taking board exams, because that's how medical schools rank each other, and everybody wants, all these medical schools want to appear as so-called best medical school, and they base that largely on board exam performance. So medical school, unfortunately, isn't really so much designed to create good clinicians as it is to promote the image of the school itself through high board exam scores, and also to prepare medical students for medical residency. So that's a real tragedy, of course, because medical school should be producing competent clinicians, not good test takers and kind of drones for the medical residency programs. So again, in summary, from my experience, having attended and graduated from 3 different accredited graduate doctorate level programs, naturopathic medicine really provided the best education for the treatment and understanding of infectious diseases. As I said before, I consider this to be a legitimate tragedy that medical schools are not really preparing students for their roles as clinicians, but rather preparing them to take exams and then preparing them to work in medical residency programs. As a result, from the best I can tell, medical students and residents actually learn very little about infectious diseases, practically zero regarding vaccines, a little bit more perhaps about antiviral drugs, but they are taught nothing other than ridicule about clinical nutrition, and they learn absolutely nothing about